Now, for those expecting this to be a long detailing of stats and figures about the treaty carriers, might I please refer you to my key ship series? Because that's where I deal with that sort of information. This is going to be a discussion about why. About why the ships were designed the way they were designed, why everything was put together the way it was, why the carriers went the way they did with the treaties, and why the treaties went the way they did. So yeah, it's going to be a bit of a normal video and also a bit of a abnormal video in that regard. Normal video and it's about the conception going on, the discussions going on, what the different navies wanted from their carriers, and how that changed over time. And this is something which has to be appreciated because with the time it takes some ships to be built, what a navy thinks they want out of a carrier, i.e., what they think they want to do with a carrier, and therefore what they think they want out of a carrier, can change. And the carrier they might have built and felt was going to be a white elephant turns out to be a really useful carrier. And the carrier which they built with the fountain of all their dreams and understanding and vision turns out to be terrible. Turns out to be terrible. And for some navies, they built a lot of carriers early. The trouble is, tonnage-wise, that means you use your tonnage up early, and that also means you use your tonnage up when you had your least understanding of what an efficient design for a carrier would be. Conversions are another good example of this. They're often inefficient ships because they are by their nature going to be inefficient because you have compromises based on what were they originally designed and built for. How much of that construction was built? How much have you been able to change around? If you consider the most frequent conversion is basically battle cruiser or large light cruiser. I won't get into the whole joy of the Fisher Follies as a idea from the get-go. Conversion into an aircraft carrier. But the trouble is stabilization and balancing for a vessel which is supposed to be a gunnery vessel, even a large caliber gunnery vessel, versus an aircraft carrier is very different. Where the weights are going to be in the hull, where the metacentric height will be in the hull. All these things differ. So, treaty carriers are fun. They really are. And I'm sorry this is delayed. It was supposed to be up on Tuesday, but I spent most of Monday and the vast majority of Tuesday and a good chunk of today moving stuff around in the house, getting it ready for a move. In fact, once I finish this video, I'm going to go move more some stuff around and then come out and record some more. So it's basically my constant day at the moment is moving stuff around my house, preparing it for a move, moving boxes, building boxes, and recording videos. It's fun. With that in said, let's go for a shameless book plug. Now, hopefully there will be more books for me to shamelessly plug soon, but as I've said before, whilst please liking, sharing, supporting the channel really does help. Those people who choose to be patrons, those people who choose to be members of the channel and contribute money towards the purchasing of more books, and the other stuff which is going along, especially with the move and the new office I'm going to have and the facilities I'm hopefully going to put into there so I can do more for you all. It's just, I can't really express in words how thankful it makes me. I really can't. But, saying all that, I'm an academic. I'm a university lecturer. By training and inclination. And if I want to continue working in that field and be promoted in that field, I need to publish books. I need to be refable. And so, here's my book. I like it. There are many others who've written books as well. I do acknowledge all their books they've written, but this is mine. It's on its second edition, but it's still mine. It's cute. It's got a beautiful front cover, let's be honest. That's my main worry with my next books, are they going to have as nice a front cover. I hope they do. I really do. And every time someone purchases it, that helps. That helps with my academic career. That helps with my publisher, making them happier. Although I'm self-publishing my next books. I'm quite simply doing Kindle and potentially as Amazon print on order. I'm looking into that. Various people have discussed that with me. I'm not sure how you go around setting that up and how you sort it out, but I'm looking into it because it looks interesting to me. But yeah. So any ideas on that and any advice on those, please do put them below. I always ask a question at the end of a video, but this is an honest thing at this point. If you have any ideas on self-publishing on Kindle, good ideas on what software and how I should shape those things, and I've been talking with Glyn Stewart, who's absolutely excellent on it. But any other ideas, I'm always happy to have more information. If I have the task of having to sift through information and pick from it which is relevant to me and relevant to my scenario, that makes me far happier than thinking I only have this, which is not much information, so I don't really have a rounded picture. I'm not excluding anything because it's not relevant to me, and that makes me feel like I don't have a full enough picture. So yeah, any more information about that, about the Amazon publishing system, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So, the Washington Treaty. Now, what's interesting about the Washington Treaty is this is the first time someone tries to define an aircraft carrier. They also decide they're going to define something called stand displacement, which is just... oh, it's so much fun. It truly is. Let's be honest, if you are defining stand displacement of a ship, and listen to this description, and if you've never heard a description of stand displacement before, then you are in for a treat. The stand displacement of a ship is the displacement of the ship completely, fully manned, engined, and equipped, ready for sea, including all armament and ammunition, equipment, outfit provisions, and fresh water for crew, miscellaneous stores and implements of every description that are intended to be carried in war without fuel or reserve feed on water on board. So, you're supposed to include, by that definition, the weight of the crew. Because it's fully manned. But not fuel or water. The word ton in the present treaty, except in the expression metric tons, shall be understood to mean a ton of 2,240 pounds. That's 1,016 kilos. Vessels now completed shall retain their present ratings of displacement tonnage in accordance with their national system of measurement. However, a power expressing displacement metric tons shall be considered for the application of the present treaty as owning only the equivalent of displacement in tons of 2,240 pounds. A vessel completed hereafter shall be rated at its displacement tonnage when in the standard condition defined herein. So, crew, all armament, ammunition, equipment, provisions, fresh water for the crew. Fresh water for the crew is included, but feed water isn't included. Just imagine the length of discussion that went into defining that. And I'm just waiting for the debates that would have gone on between them going over the different sizes of people. Fully manned. So stand displacement is fun. However, there are some other ideas tucked into this treaty. There is the fact that no vessel of war exceeding 10,000 tons of displacement, other than a capital ship or aircraft carrier, shall be acquired by or constructed by or within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers. So pretty much, if it's over 10,000 tons, it's either a capital ship or it's a carrier. And if it's below 10,000 tons, there are no restrictions on how many you can build. Aircraft carriers are limited to 27,000 tons standard displacement. And the different powers, well, the US Navy and the Royal Navy are allowed 5 of those carriers, 27,000 ton carriers. France and Italy are allowed 60,000 tons of carrier, so they could build 2 and have 6,000 tons left over. Or I suppose they could build 3 20,000 ton carriers. And for Japan, they get 81,000 tons. That's 3 carriers. And by the way, the 10,000 tons in their excess of, in terms of metric, in terms of 10,000 tons of an aircraft carrier, that's 10,160 metric tons. There's also, of course, limitations on they're not allowed guns bigger than 8 inches. So you can't turn an aircraft carrier into a battle carrier, but you could maybe into a cruiser carrier. If you really wanted to build something which was going to be that big a target with that limited firepower for that kind of role. What does the Washington Treaty truly tell you about aircraft carriers at this time? That no one really understands what they're for, because if you actually have to put in the limitation of gun size on that, then obviously you think that some people might genuinely try and do that with their aircraft carriers. And to an extent that does make sense, because let's be honest, when we're talking about 1920, 22, that period the gun is definitely superior to the aircraft. But even the Royal Navy, which had been operating aircraft a lot in World War I and had been putting them in a lot of places, even they didn't until the height of World War II flirt with the idea of a battle carrier. And still, the question that was asked to anyone who put it forward was, what does this solution solve that isn't solved by building proper aircraft carriers, which we're building, and the existing capital ship force? What does this provide? It could use the Lion class hulls. If we need to use the Lion class hulls, we'll be building a Lion class battleship. Don't worry. But what about our aircraft carrier needs? That's what the light fleets and the Audacious class and the Malta class and the various other classes of carriers we are building are for. So without much further ado, let's get into the Royal Navy. And this is actually furious and either courageous or glorious. No one's quite sure. My instinct is to say it's glorious because it's a Mediterranean, and glorious used to hang out there quite a lot. But it's possibly not. It's possibly not. Because Furious didn't hang out there that often. Furious was more often hanging out in the Atlantic home fleet. But there again, most of the Atlantic waters where they're ever pictured, the sea isn't as calm. And it's labelled as Mediterranean. It's an interesting question to get into. It truly is. So the thing is, what is the Royal Navy looking for with these ships? When they're building them, what are they looking for? Well, they're already into the idea of you need to be able to rapidly launch fighters, because at this point they're still doing visual range, visual identification of range, which is why they have the lower flight deck, because that is literally so that the fighters stored forward can take off straight out of the hangar instead of you having to get them up on the flight deck. It also helps with if you are arranging your strike up on deck to launch your strike aircraft in their full torpedo attack role, and you see an enemy attack coming in, you can launch fighters without disrupting the air group. You can just launch them. It's quick and easy. They go straight out the front. And there were honest discussions when it came later on to fitting the ships with catapults, or accelerators as the Royal Navy called them, because catapults were what used on regular warships, by capital ships and cruisers, to launch aircraft from them. So to differentiate, they had accelerators for carriers and catapults for other ships. Because there's a slightly different system. There's a trolley system, etc. used for launching seaplanes, flying boats. Anyway, the British at certain points do consider sticking a catapult on the lower deck. The idea being that that solves a problem, and you can still carry on using them for launching fighters. But at a certain point, there is an honest debate going on past that as to what to do with that area. The Royal Navy's building new carriers in the late 1930s. They're starting the construction. They've got the plans. They've got the Ark Royal in service. They've got the 4 Illustrious coming after it. Implacable, Indefatigable. They've got Unicorn. They've got all those coming through. And I think pretty much they'd mentally decided, even if not officially, that they weren't going to do what was the obvious upgrade plan for Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. They were conversions, and they weren't really worth it. The obvious upgrade plan, of course, being to extend the flight deck forward, over that forward section of the main deck, and increase hangar space. So you have more hangar space, and you have more of a longer flight deck, and then you can carry more aircraft and launch more aircraft, or at least maintain your air group number of 60 aircraft with the growing size of aircraft. But honestly, these ships, by the time you get into the late 1930s, are already fairly worn out. The Royal Navy uses its carriers hard for 20-odd years, trying to develop its naval aviation doctrine. Because remember, it has to think of a doctrine which is going to work in the as well in the North Sea and North Atlantic, as it does in the Far East, the Pacific. It has to be working in the Mediterranean, the same as the South China Sea. It has to work wherever the Royal Navy finds itself in the world. It can't afford to have a doctrine which is a single ocean doctrine, because it can find itself fighting in everyone else in the world. Whereas if you consider for the Japanese, if they find themselves in a scenario where they are fighting a naval aviation operation in the North Atlantic, then either a lot of interesting things have happened, in which case they should have had time to develop and modify their doctrine appropriately, or something has gone really weird really quick. It's just not likely they're going to find themselves doing that kind of operation in the North Atlantic. So, yeah, you have to think it through. One of the things the British really do like with these carriers, and they are really the heart of, is developing their night strike operations. Glorious, especially in the Mediterranean, is doing non-stop night operations, but Courageous and Furious, all 3 of the sisters really are key and core to development of the Royal Navy's night strike and night flying operations. And mentioning the Japanese brings us to Akagi and Kaga. Now, the thing is, the Japanese wanted it to be Amagi and Akagi. They wanted the 2 battle cruisers because they wanted their carriers to be fast. Fast and big. One of the really interesting things with the Japanese is they very quickly go on for fast and big. But their initial idea is multiple flying off decks, fast and big. Again, with a similar idea, but it was a case of, right, and we're going to have multiple hangars. We're going to be able to take off out of all of them, and also have landing on the top. So it's kind of... how do I put this? It's kind of like they've decided we're going to go for a multiple aircraft operation so we can maintain a lot of aircraft operating simultaneously. We can be landing aircraft on the flight deck on the top, and we've got two lower taking off positions they can be taking off from. We can have fighters taking off from the middle one, and we can have torpedo bombers or strike aircraft taking off from the lower one. Honestly, you couldn't make it more complicated if you tried. But it does have advantages. It allows for rapid operation and rapid launch of airgroup. The reality is, though, as aircraft grow and get bigger, this becomes less and less a sustainable idea. The world changes. I'd also point out that Akagi and Kaga didn't have the same top weight issues some of the later Japanese carriers had. Not when initially built. Mostly because they've got a lot of stability built into their hulls, but also the top, how do I put this politely? The framing used for a lot of their superstructure and flight deck hangar construction is very lightweight. Which is fine with lighter aircraft. You start getting strain as aircraft get heavier. This is another thing that is sort of an ongoing battle for most naval aviation development. It's the fact that the aircraft and the carriers have to develop in simpatico. They have to develop as one. Because there is no point having aircraft which are so heavy they're going to break your carrier every time they operate from it. And there is no point having a carrier which is designed for aircraft which may never exist. You both want to future-proof your carrier, but you can future-proof it too much because you don't know how aircraft are going to develop. For example, if the Royal Navy had really pushed in the idea of it when they first were looking at HMS Hermes, she could have been the world's finest full-deck seaplane operating carrier, but not have any capability for operating fixed-wing aircraft because, well, when I say fixed-wing aircraft, land planes, sorry, they're all fixed-wing. She could not have any ability to operate land planes because they would have been able to theoretically land and recover on her, but she wasn't going to have any systems to really support that because, after all, seaplanes are the future of naval aviation. They're all going to land beside her, their motor up, and she'll quickly be able to take them aboard. They were talking about sticking a ramp on the back. They were talking about a telescoping crane, all sorts of things for recovering the aircraft. So basically, the top deck was launching aircraft, the bottom was recovering. Now, the world doesn't go that way. And the Royal Navy had hedged their bets in Hermes construction. Just in case. But this is a scenario. You can go too far one way, you can go too far the other way. And that's actually a factor for quite a lot of aircraft construction. If we consider Hosho, the first Japanese aircraft carrier, which I talked about in last month's version of this video, that was a very interesting vessel, but by World War II, it was no longer able to operate anything but the second line training aircraft because new aircraft were too heavy for it. They would bash up its flight deck and bash it up. These ships are the starting point. These conversions are the starting point of navies developing. What's really funny, though, is, as mentioned, some navies, even while they were building something, perceived it, or before it even began, as going to be a white elephant. And a good example of that are the Lexington and Saratoga, which truly were thought by the US Navy to going to be white elephants while under construction. So, why were these vessels felt to be white elephants before they were even finished? Was it because of the 8-inch guns, adding so much additional weight to their metacentric height? My personal bugbear with this design. And before anyone goes, they needed to defend themselves if they find themselves against a cruiser. A, under what circumstances your carrier alone finding yourself fighting a cruiser? B, Under the Washington Treaty, which is what they're constructed under, prior to the London Treaty, there is no cumulative limit on cruiser numbers. Build a frigating cruiser. Okay? That is what you do. You do not stick 8-inch guns that high up in your carrier. That is weight, that is armor, that is all sorts of extra additions going up the already heavy, very heavy because of the island structure, etc., compared to the other side of the vessel, starboard side. Just look, people often go, well, what about if they had twin 5-inch guns? I'm not particularly keen on the twin 5-inch guns there, but they're they weigh a lot less, and they have a lot less of an impact on metacentric height and the entire body of the ship than the 8-inch guns. Preferably, I prefer the guns to be, well, as you can see, these ones, which they do have, they're secondaries, which are all flight deck height, or rather below, a deck level below flight deck height. That is about the area where I like the guns, because it gives them the field of fire necessary, protects them from the water, allows them to be visible and usable, but isn't so high up. And I prefer them not to be 8-inch, because that's a very large, very heavy gun. A nice dual-purpose 4.5-inch, 5-inch mount will do me quite happily, because that will A, deter aircraft, and B, if destroyers are doing a mass attack, that's something. That's enough targets that they could get past my escorting cruisers. But honestly, I should have an escorting cruiser. And I should have some destroyers with me. And you can again go, well, you know, they didn't know that when they were all building these ships, and I can forgive that. I can't forgive the 8-inch guns. Okay? They should have built them an escorting cruiser. But they didn't. That wasn't in their doctrine point. It gets there, wasn't there at that point. So why do they think they're going to be white elephants? Well, there's all sorts of debates of whether they're going to be long enough, of whether they have enough lifts, whether they're going to fit the actual doctrine which the US Navy started to develop based on the work of Sims. And the wargaming work, especially, has been driving their doctrine. And this leads to an interesting thing, because they're looking at building the USS Ranger. That's supposed to be going to be the absolute bomb. I mean, that's going to be the best thing they're ever going to have. That is going to be amazing, according to their thinking about their doctrine. And this is the really interesting thing, because there is one thing developing a doctrine, then there is how you think you're going to use that doctrine, and then there is experience of actually trying to employ that doctrine and what you really need. And the classic example here is shown with Lexington, Saratoga, and Ranger. Ranger is built according to how they think they're going to need to operate the doctrine when it's being designed. Not actually by the time it's actually being built, but it's too late for them to change the design by that point. Lexington and Saratoga, whilst they're being built, are felt to not fit with that doctrine. When they actually start using them, oh my, they fit with the doctrine. And that's why the Yorktown class are actually more to do with the operational experience of Lexington and Saratoga, and Ranger is more to do with the initial development of doctrine. And the Bureau of Air. The Bureau of Air are really, really fun. It takes a huge amount of evidence to get them away from the idea of a flush deck carrier. Virtually, the naval attaché in Britain has to take out a very senior Royal Navy officer for a drink and explain to them what is currently making him cry, to the point at which the Royal Navy officer sympathises and pretty much hands over, with permission of the Admiralty, because they are building relationships and still trying to share information between them and the Americans and the Japanese at this point, and everyone knows, basically hands over the redacted, or rather reduced versions of the reports of operating flush deck carriers. And even then the Bureau of Air tries to go, well, you know, the British aren't doing it right. It's kind of like whenever you hear someone using it, trying to put forward some of those idealized political systems like communism, etc., which in an ideal, perfect world where humans aren't human, might work. The trouble is when they're being done by humans, they don't work. But everyone always imagines, no, communism could work if, Codicil, I was the one implementing it. Because I would be better. I would not be prey to these human failings. I would be godlike. Well, it's the same with the Bureau of Air and carrier design. For a long while, they're thinking, no, 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 we would be better than the British. We would do a better flush deck design than the British. And honestly, I think the British actually give them the information more from the point of view of just watching to see if it, how much the, whether the Americans use the information to try and do a better flush deck design, in which case they get to laugh because they're repeating their same mistakes, or whether they use the information to not get a flush deck design. It's just, oh boy, there is no downside to this as far as the British are concerned. It's just something fun to watch. But as said, Lessing and Saratoga, when they enter service, they are great. They are really good. And it's these ships, more than any other, which A, confirm their doctrine, B, start actually being used to operationalize their doctrine, because it had been created by wargaming, and moving forward beyond that, to actually turn the doctrine into something which they can viably implement across a wider fleet. And so I would say the Yorktowns, which when we get to them, they're sort of an idealized version of what they would have built based on the Lexington and Saratoga if they hadn't been conversions. What they would have liked to imagine themselves to have built, what they would have built. Let's be honest, what they'd have actually built would be in a whole load of Rangers, and then they'd have operated them and realized they were up a creek without a paddle, but that's a completely different matter. And so that leads us to the London Treaty. Because basically those are the 6 which are pure Washington Treaty. The next ones start to flip between being part of design in one era, built in the other era. It just gets more fun. But yeah, some are just interesting. So the London Treaty shows that people understand naval aviation more now, in theory. In practice, it also shows that there is some real silliness going on. I would say Article 4 is a classic example of silliness. It's more about shutting down the Japanese than actually thinking about what is useful for you. If you're the British, and even if you're the Americans, for example, especially if you're the British, carriers of small carriers are really useful. The Royal Navy would actually really like small carriers in terms of cruiser carriers for protecting convoys, for sitting at trade nodes around the world and providing protection against surface raiders and all the other threats which can pop up around the world. The whole thing is, we would really like small carriers. Because you've got a treaty cumulative tonnage limitation. So the only way you can have enough carriers to do all those missions is if you can make small carriers. But again, the Royal Navy's tried this out with Hermes, with Argus, and realized that small carriers are incredibly inefficient, because if you consider, yes, you need, if for a larger carrier you need a larger engine, yes, you need more fuel and all these things, but actually, as a percentage, they take up less space in the hull. So the larger the carrier you get, the more percentage of the hull you can devote to supporting aviation and aviation operations. That's the advantage of bigger carriers. This is why we say bigger carriers are more efficient. Because after you get past a certain point, engines to power a carrier, something that's going to be big enough to be a carrier, are going to cost a certain amount of weight. As you grow the carrier in size, the engines are not going to grow in proportion to that size. They are going to have to grow, but they aren't going to get massive or they aren't going to grow at the same rate as the ship, basically. And that's an advantage. So, under a cumulative limitation system, you're going to want to try and build smaller carriers because if you're Britain, because you need to be in multiple places at once. And also it's an advantage for survivability in terms of you lose one carrier, that's only lost a certain amount of your power. But in any system which doesn't have a cumulative limit, everyone's going to be building as big a carriers as they can because they're going to be the most efficient carriers. So this is why the 27,000 ton limit is always just a theoretical limit. No one's actually going to build up to it. Lexington and Saratoga are the largest carriers anyone has in this period, and they are built up more than it, but their conversions, they have advantages because of conversion weight differentials and other things which are added into them to give them the spirit and keep them within the they're neither within the spirit nor the letter of the treaty, but they are officially within the treaty limitations. The whole scenario of it is that you can only do that if you're ignoring the cumulative limitations. And honestly, Lexington and Saratoga, because they're so big, do cause the Americans trouble with the cumulative limitations. It's one of the reasons why they do Ranger and Wasp, is to try and get in a carrier underneath the limitations, under the cumulative limitations. It's always fun. Individual and cumulative limitations in a treaty. You could say that's a belts and braces approach to it. You can certainly make that case. You could also make the case that that's overkill, and you could certainly make the case that that is likely to cause everyone trouble as things go on, and it does. It truly does cause people trouble. They've also enhanced the definition of aircraft carrier. For the purpose of the Washington Treaty, the definition of an aircraft carrier given in Chapter 2, Part 4 of the said treaty is hereby replaced by the following definition. The expression aircraft carrier includes any surface vessel of war, whatever its displacement, designed for the specific and exclusive purpose of carrying aircraft and so constructed that aircraft can be launched therefrom and landed thereon. The fitting of a landing on or flying off platform or deck on the capital ship, cruiser or destroyer, provided such vessel was not designed or adapted exclusively as an aircraft carrier, should not cause any vessel so fitted to be charged against or classified in the category of aircraft carriers. No capital ship in existence on the 1st of April 1930 shall be fitted with a landing on platform or deck. They've added that with some modifications to armament, but basically they've left aircraft carrier, broadly speaking, the same as it was beforehand. They've just closed a loophole which allowed Ryujo and other ships by the Japanese to be built. Which again was sad, honestly. As said, I would have preferred, and I think historically the world would have worked out better, if they'd gone with a policy of fleet carriers are 27,000 tons. We're going to create this new thing of cruiser carriers or light fleet carriers or light carriers, of like we're doing with cruisers, of 15,000 tons and below. You're allowed 135,000 tons of fleet carriers and 135,000 tons of light fleet carriers or light carriers, etc. And whatever you want to call it. And let that would be sort of for Britain and America. They'd therefore be allowed to have 9 light carriers and 5 full carriers. I have no doubt again the Americans would probably I think Wasps would be far more common. But even, Wasp is a good ship. Wasp is still limited compared to Yorktowns and other vessels, but what a whole slew of Wasps would not be something the US Navy would be very upset about having. The Royal Navy would have produced something which was, well, probably not too dissimilar to the design of HMS Unicorn, which we'll be talking about in a bit, because she's 16,770 tons in standard. But she is pretty heavy for her size, because of her desire for having maintenance facilities, etc. So, I wouldn't be surprised if you can produce a fairly decent 15,000 ton design based off it. The Colossus class, for example, which are based off are 13,200 tons in standard. So, again, you could go for something which was even heavier than them. Maybe get even 13,500 ton ships. Who knows what the Royal Navy does, but I wouldn't be surprised as the Royal Navy produced something to provide them with presence around the world, and would probably have built it in this period. It's an interesting scenario of the 1930 London Treaty. If you ever want to work it through as a war game in the inclusion of an equivalent 135,000 ton treaty limit for small carriers of under 15,000 tons, and work it down so that everyone has their own proportional equivalent. So they still, the Japanese would have 81,000 tons. The French and the Italians would have 60,000 tons of small carriers, and just watch out about how the various navies would react. I think for Japan, it would have caused could have caused some reproachment in some ways, because it would have been a case of, yeah, we see what you're doing. Instead of slamming this door on you, we're going to let you do it, but you're going to be limited. And it could have been less of a finality than what actually happened. It was taken as a bit of an insult in Japan. Some of the clauses here which shut down their development of work for smaller carriers. But also, it would have seriously changed a lot of the world in terms of operations, because if the Royal Navy has, let's say, 9 15,000 ton vessels, standard displacement, at the beginning of World War II, those are going to be leading the anti-submarine warfare operations, not the fleet carriers. So they're going to be the ones who are not Courageous and Ark Royal out doing anti-submarine warfare operations. Those are going to be the things. They're going to be down with Harwood at the River Plate, and more on top of that, Ark Royal herself, all those fleet carriers, they're going to be very different vessels, because the Royal Navy might go, okay, yeah, we're still going to build them 22,000 tons or this, so we can get 6 of them out of the limit instead of the 5, but do they really need to? Because they can have a theoretical strength of 14 carriers, and they can pass off their cruising roles, the reconnaissance, escort, convoy duties, and fleet supply to those smaller carriers. So therefore, their fleet carriers can afford to be far more well-rounded vessels. They might do it, they might not. They might go, we want 6 carriers each of 22,500 tons, so we can have 15 carriers overall. But again, it will change things dramatically. But they don't. The London Treaty instead is just as reactionary in its form as the Washington Treaty, and instead of trying to embrace things and make things better for everyone, it's going the absolutist route of the best way to prevent war is to stop anyone having any weapon systems. And this is where the treaties really start to annoy me, because there have been sayings like Sivi Pacem Parabellum, in times of peace prepare for war, which can also and has also been translated to those who seek peace should first prepare for war, around for a long, long time. Those sayings have lasted since the time of Rome. And there are people who say, well, those are very cynical phrases, they don't reflect our modern world. Time and time again, people have said that. And time again, the people who usually have the most peaceful life and usually have the least issues are the ones who are prepared. Because if you're prepared, you can deter far better. You can manage the risk of conflict far better. You're far less afraid when you're dealing with things. And usually, they like to say the phrases like strength, respect, strength. Well, it doesn't. What happens is bullies respect confidence. And usually it's bullies and people who are thinking logically who start wars. And they usually, when they're dealing with something which is confident and strong, and doesn't show a thing, and doesn't hesitate, going, we don't want you to do that. That's crossing a line. Step back, or there'll be trouble, unequivocally, because they are confident. That will usually cause them to back off. And again, treaties weren't having that impact, but these are all some of the thinking, the ideas of what do you want your carriers to do? Do you have enough carriers that are going into the construction phase now? So Ranger is the first example here, and I've already been talking about her. She's designed from the Sims ideas and the doctrines which have come out of the wargaming. And then she's pushed through by Bureau of Air, and they've gone really, really far into this, and they've got the design approved, everything, and they're building her. And they start her building, and they're getting all the information from Lexington to Saratoga, and it's making them question a lot of decisions. And as good as Ranger is in stats, she turns out to not be so good in operations. One of the most interesting stats that comes out about her, one of the most interesting discussions, is that she's restricted from operations in the Pacific and is put back on Atlantic duty. And I found that really strange, because I was looking at it going, well, every seaman I've always talked about was that the Atlantic is a far rougher ocean operating in the Pacific. So what's the problem? What the problem turns out to be is infrastructure. The infrastructure on the east coast of the United States is far superior at this point to the infrastructure that's on the west coast. And the Ranger keeps having issues. And so it's almost not an oceanic issue, although the Pacific is wearing her down. It's the fact that whilst the Atlantic will wear her down even worse, they're actually able to repair it more easily in the Atlantic and more quickly, and when it's a smaller issue, than in the Pacific. She's a fun ship. She's an attempt to square a circle. She truly is. And it doesn't work. But the thing is, she's also a useful ship in her time in World War II. When she's used to support things like Operation Torch, etc., she does a good job. She's just not something you really want to take into a high conflict scenario, because of all the ideas pushed through because of A, they're obsessed with keeping her underweight, and B, some of their ideas about making a flush deck, even funnels and all sorts of issues. It's just, they had so many ideas they tried to cram into one hull. And that's always a problem. For every single generation, that's always been a problem. The rule of thumb, again, that's come through history, is you don't want to try more than 3 new innovative ideas in any particular ship. New tech versions of the same ideas, that's fine. You're going to put those in. That's understood. Okay? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about 3 new revolutions. If you talk about capital ships and the Dreadnought construction 1910s, the British, when you look at between each variation of their capital ships, are sticking very closely to it that they are only making 3 big changes. Gun layout, that would be a big change. Gun type, that would be a big change. Okay, then you're only allowed 1 more thing. If you're going to say speed, so we're putting in more engines and power, okay, that's fine. Then we're not putting in new types of engines. And that's actually a problem, because if you consider the Queen Elizabeth class, they are stunted because they've got the new gun layout, they've got the 15-inch guns, they're trying for new speed, but they're not using oil-fired boilers, the small tube oil-fired boilers, which they could have used, which would probably enable them to actually get to the speed. But that would have been another change. And the whole conservatism leaves it. I would personally have liked to see them implement that one. I think it wouldn't have been a bridge too far. I do admit the small tube boilers of 1912, 1913 are not as great as the ones of 1920, but they are pretty darn good, and it could have been interesting for them. But again, with Ranger, the Bureau of Aeronautics, really, she is their passion project. Just as much as the airships I talked about when I talked about USS Akron. and USS Macon. She is a passion project for them. And they are really, really obsessed with trying to maximize air group. It's one of the things I have to talk about quite often in the US Navy is they don't like small carriers. And people take that as they're not like me saying they're not liking light carriers when they operated escort carriers and they operate the America class and all these things, and I go, no, they're not small carriers. The America class and the modern LHDs, they're A, are not carriers, and B, they're not small. And when you're 40,000 tons plus, you are not a small carrier, okay? You're not. Any world standard, you are not a small carrier, so don't go there. But what I mean by it, when Americans not wanting to operate small carriers, they don't want to operate small air group carriers. They like large ones. They like large air groups. They operate escort carriers in World War II because they have to. Because they need to have enough aviation to cover enough territories. They need enough infrastructure. The only way they can do it is with escort carriers. That isn't because they want to. That isn't because they like them. It's because they have to. They like larger carriers because they like larger air groups and they like to be able to operate them efficiently. Because their entire doctrine is based around speed of launch, the volume of aircraft you can get into the air, both for defense and offense. They believe the first punch, your first punch has to be your strongest punch because that will be your most effective punch. So they want to put everything into that hit, whether it's a defensive hit or an offensive hit. They're not wrong, but it does shape their entire design philosophy. And this is where you get the Yorktown class coming, because these are really the Americans going, you know what? Lexington and Saratoga were actually pretty darn good at this. And they build them alongside each other. Yorktown and Enterprise are as close as sisters ever can be in terms of ships. They are built next to each other. They are built not just by the same people, but from the same cloth. And they are built to full size, full displacement, full weight, like Lexington and Saratoga are, but these are the closest to the US Navy's doctrine that can be expressed in carrier construction while the treaty system still exists. The only thing closer to their doctrinal view of aircraft carriers from this period will be in the Midway class, which represent the absolute apex of the American views on carrier survivability and size and operation and capacity. Yorktowns are closer to that than the Essexes are. The Essexes are how big can we build as fast as we can to get as many as we can. The Yorktowns, like the Midways coming, are basically, this is our doctrine. We need to build our doctrine. This is the doctrine after it's been refined through exercises for Lexington and Saratoga. The big fleet studies. Those massive fleet problems. Those operations are what are critical to developing the Yorktown class and the ideas which go into them. And again, they're still being built within the treaty limits. But what you will notice is the guns have gone down to that deck below flight deck level. They are now balanced. They've got a hangar level catapult for rapid launch of fighters, which I really do love. They have some really cool structures on them. And if we go back to Ranger, the first thing you'll notice when you look at them is they look quite filled in compared to Ranger. And that's part of them making her as structurally strong as she can be. Because one of the things of having Ranger as open as she is it puts a lot of wear on her structure and the rest of the structure. There's not a lot of support there for it. And that's one of the things which causes the issues which need to be constantly being fixed and checked. There's a lot of torsion on the deck, to use one of the phrases which I read in an engineering report about Ranger. It's a fun thing to think about, but literally it's When we built this as light as we could do, and the deck is literally at various points, which is not good. It can make landing very interesting for an aircraft if it comes in at the slightly wrong angle. But also, these ships are about the US Navy's growing idea of a raiding doctrine. Their 1942 carrier raids do not come from nowhere. The US Navy is developing a raiding doctrine through every one of their fleet problems. They are literally working through and going, hang on, we can do this. They actually carry out raids themselves with their carriers successfully on Pearl Harbor twice. One of the interesting things about Pearl Harbor and Taranto is they are the most telegraphed hits of any in any point. Their own navies have carried out those exercises. Everyone's carried out those exercises. Everyone's been practicing the same kill, the same operation. Because whilst the Royal Navy starts off and really has vengeance in its soul, because of the whole Williamshaven hiding of the Imperial High Seas Fleet in World War I, and the fact they didn't come out to fight, and so they couldn't get their glorious victory, so they're going to go in after them. That desire has spread because of quite a lot of admirals having a similar logic of thinking. What happens if our enemy refuses to come out and fight us? Well, that's going to tie down all our resources, keeping them blocked in, unless we can find a way to stop them blocking us in. And also, what's the quickest, easiest way to kill the enemy? When they're in port and they can't maneuver. Hardest time to hit a ship is when it's at sea, maneuvering and able to fire back at all axes. If it's in a port, it can't fire in that direction for fear of hitting people, can't fire in that direction for hitting its own ammunition dump, it can't fire in that direction for hitting a fuel dump, that direction is another ship, that direction is another ship. It's a nightmare, is a port. In fact, it's the scariest place to try and defend the ship, so that's where you want to hit them. Then we have Soryu and Hiryu. Now, for those of you sitting there going, Alex, there's something weird. Have you flipped one of those pictures around? No, I haven't. No, the Japanese were having a similar idea as the British were about how operating carriers alongside each other. And joint carrier operations doctrine. It's a really interesting idea. But whereas the British went, we like this, but we're not making any changes to the actual design of the carrier to suit this because that's going to adversely affect things landing. The Japanese thought, no. Our pilots, we can train them to be better than this. We can stick the island on the port. And so the two carriers can operate together. Sail alongside each other. And the one with the starboard island can go on the port side. And the one with the port island can go on the starboard side. So the islands are together, so that makes communication easy between the two carriers. And the aircraft can launch and recover like that. Now, the whole reason why you have the island on the starboard side of the carrier, the whole reason you have it, is because when a pilot, and most pilots are trained to fly like this, come in and they have an issue, what is their reaction? That. Or that. It's usually the aircraft goes off the port, flies off the port, and you're pulling up. So you're going to pull up and push. So you're going out to port. You are not inclined naturally, when you fly like that, to go to starboard. So if you have your island structure on your starboard, they don't hit it and they fly off. If you have it on your port side, they hit it. But experimenting's good. And you have to remember, these carriers are starting to come in service at the point at which Japan has left the treaty system. Okay? Soryu is launched in 1935, when she's giving her notice. Hiryu is launched in 1937, when she's left the treaty system. So honestly, the Japanese have left off quite a lot of their construction to the point at which they don't have to worry about the treaty system anymore. There is a good reason for this. Remember that 81,000 tons limitation? This is why the Japanese spend a lot of time thinking about their carrier construction, but don't build a lot in the earlier period, because Akagi, Kaga, Hosho, Ryujo all take that up. Now, I think I've skipped Ryujo, and that's because, honestly, that special beast I'm going to leave out for entire key ships, but we will get there at some point. She's going to be included in entire key ships as a specialist subject of equal pain for everyone involved. The Royal Navy have Ark Royal. Why do the Royal Navy have Ark Royal? Well, we talked about raiding and we talked about strikes on harbour earlier. The Royal Navy have a problem, okay? They are looking at a scenario where they have to operate in the South China Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and also through the Atlantic and Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Okay, right then. So they end up, instead of going down the whole we're going to have one type carrier fits all scenarios, they're going down the scenario of, well, we need a carrier which has a large enough strike punch and strike group that it can do the attack on a fleet in harbour role. And we need a carriers which are survivable enough that they can operate with the fleet when it's punching when it's going to be in the front, heading through things like the South China Sea, etc. So almost you end up with the idea of a multi-carrier fleet where you're going to have one set of carriers with the fleet and one set of carriers in a strike role. And they even have the cruiser carrier doctrine as well, add on top of it for small carriers. And what's this all about? It's basically the fact that you can't get the air group size the Royal Navy would desperately like for their carriers on a carrier with the survivability they would desperately like for their carriers because of the areas it's going to operate in, on a size suitable that enables you to get enough of those carriers in the cumulative budget you're allowed. So the Royal Navy gives up trying to square that particular circle and just goes, right then, so we'll build a strike carrier, Ark Royal, and then we'll build fleet carriers. And that's pretty much what they're sort of going with. So this is the Royal Navy strike carrier. This is usually the point at which someone goes, no, she's built on American and Japanese lines. No, she's not. She's still got a lot more survivability built into her than most of their designs. Although she does have, to save tonnage, she has issues with her torpedo defenses and other things. Which is great fun considering she was used for ASW at the beginning of the war and eventually ends up getting sunk by a submarine torpedo and bad counter-flooding because, well, let's be honest, she's got a very high metacentric height. This is one of the tallest carriers that was ever operated by anyone. She is massive. And again, it's because of her hangar. She has a double hangar structure. So she has two hangars, and they're quite large hangars. Now again, why is the Royal Navy going down this route? This is supposed to be their strike carrier, but it's still got to do what the other carriers have got to do. And the Royal Navy has manoeuvred, because of its night strike development and its other technologies, has gone with a slightly different direction than the US Navy and the IJN have gone with in terms of carrier development. Both of them have sort of focused on the big punch, the Alpha Strike. And the British would like to have the capability for the Alpha Strike, and they do in their exercises think that through. But they also think South China Sea, Mediterranean, they're likely to deal with land operations. And if they're doing land operations, i.e. operations from land-based aircraft, and if they're going to do a blockade on Japan, which is Britain's war plan for Japan, they're going to need to deal with land-based operations, which means you have to also emphasize continuous aviation operations, and CAP, and combat air patrol, and developing things around that. And they've tried various things with that. They've had spotter aircraft, reconnaissance spotter aircraft, be airborne early warning systems, thanks to having a lookout in them, looking out, going, I've got my binoculars, where are the enemy, can I see them from distance? All sorts of things they've tried to give their fighters warning time, and they've got to basically the idea that you've got to have the fighters airborne already in the 1930s, that's their constant philosophy. And realistically, the Royal Navy starts to build its carriers when it's having to make a choice around its carrier operations, prioritizing the Alpha Strike capability to being a large strike group, survivability, or prioritizing this sort of having enough lifts and being able to do the whole rolling operation in terms of the constant operation of aircraft, and the constantly flying off strikes and the constantly flying off smaller strikes and smaller and fighter waves, etc., and all these things. The British go, right then, we're going to orientate Ark Royal around being able to do both the constant waves and the big strike, but you can't then have the third thing, which is the survivability we want. And the next class, the illustrious class we're getting into it, are oriented around the idea of, right then, so they're going to lose some of the capability to do an alpha strike. They can still do it, but it's a far reduced strike group. But they're going to have the constant operation capability and the survivability we want. And it's trying to get all three things on the same hull in a tonnage that is limited. More by cumulative tonnage. On 27,000 tons, they could have got that carrier. On 27,000 tons, you get an implacable class happily. An implacable class, let's be honest, when you look at them, you realize very quickly, oh, you are the fusion of the idea of we can have the strike group, we can do the alpha strikes, the constant operation of aircraft, and we can have the survivability as well. Oh, great. I would say the really interesting thing again is the British don't go with deck edge lifts. But neither have the Americans up to this point. If you haven't noticed, the Americans haven't gone with deck edge lifts at this point. The Japanese haven't gone with deck edge lifts at this point. Deck edge lifts would have been a really interesting thing to implement at this point for the British, but they're not sure about them because they've lost aircraft in the North Sea so often in World War I. It got actually embarrassing. But the Americans try them out for Wasp, and Wasp is actually the first aircraft carrier to have deck edge lifts. And that's actually some of the keys to making Wasp work better than Ranger. The other thing you notice about Ranger is, compared to Wasp, Wasp has got a lot more filled in on her sides. She's a far more effective version of the vessel than Ranger was. Still not a small carrier. Okay? Her air group size just means she's not a small carrier. She may be 14,900 tons. 19,500 tons fully loaded. But she carries up to 100 aircraft. 3 elevators, 4 flight deck, 4 catapults, 2 on the flight deck, 2 on the hangar deck. She's a good design. She is. Would I prefer her over a Yorktown class? No. But there again, I prefer her over Ranger, which had sacrificed speed, dropping down to a mere 29.3 knots over its aimed hopeful speed when it was built, because, well, frankly, they decided to drop speed so that they would have as capable as it was in terms of aircraft. But the Lexington class, with their speed of 34.5 knots, had proved very, very useful. That had affected some of their doctrine. And it's one of the reasons why the Yorktown class come in at a lovely 32.5 knots. Wasp, again, sacrifices some speed. Which is 29.5 knots. But she's far more survivable than Ranger in terms of her hull structuring. And those deck edge lifts, they allow her to grow her aircraft capacity quite nicely. They allow her space. And that's the main thing about deck edge lifts. They don't take space from inside your hull. They don't take space from your hangar side. And they actually give you space in your hangar in a way. It's, again, one of the interesting things to discuss with people is that, you know, after this London Treaty, what happens is the Royal Navy goes with some of their ideas they had for maybe using deck edge lifts. Because they did look They did see what some of the Americans were producing, some of the carriers were coming out. They did look at the Wasp and go, decade lift's interesting. They don't go with them, but it would have been an interesting scenario, as it would probably have provided space on the illustrious class design to grow air group size. Above the 36-ish aircraft they normally carried, you might get up to 48. You might get up to 48 with deck edge lifts. And the reasoning for that is you would also get other space orientated inside around the hull. Have to have some design considerations made. And if you're going to do deck edge lifts, you can probably do some deck parking included as well, and so you'd start off with a 48 aircraft air group. But that's all post the Second London Treaty, and oh, this adds even more fun, because let's be honest, this treaty is all sorts of fun and merry ideas, but it doesn't really count. Why doesn't it count? Well, it's the same reason I call it the 36-37 treaty, because it's agreed in 36. But if Italy and Japan hasn't signed up by the 1st of April 1937, there's all sorts of things added onto it to deal with the escalation. And the reality is, everyone knows if they're not following the treaty, then at a certain point you're going to have to stop following the treaty to match up with them. So the treaty is not worth the paper it's written on. It truly isn't. They have a lovely article here called, on Article 5. No aircraft carrier shall exceed 23,000 tons stand displacement or carry a gun of caliber exceeding 6.1 inches. So basically what they've done is crack down on the maximum displacement of the carrier, but they've got rid of the cumulative limits. So the US Navy, Royal Navy, all these other navies signed up to the treaty could have as many carriers as they wanted, but they couldn't be greater than 23,000 tons. Which I suppose to an extent is okay, because, well, that's the Illustrious class. Ark Royal had been about 22,400 tons. The Illustrious class were 23,000 tons exactly in standard. It's kind of like the Lexington class. Okay, no one asks with the Lexington class. They say they are 37,000 tons standard exactly. The fact that that apparently uses up all their tonnage allowances and all the various tonnage allowances they can grab for them, including conversion, AA upgrade, and all sorts of things, we'll leave to one side. They are 37,000 tons exactly, because yes, when you're dealing with something which is thousands of tons, you often come in at the exact 37,000 tons in standard. And it's the same with the Illustrious class at 23,000 tons in standard. So that means, to think quite a lot of this, it's not worth worrying about. But the Royal Navy finds it very useful on two levels. The Illustrious class, I would say if they are 27,000, if they are 23,000 tons in standard, exactly, then I am sure the accounting that was presented showed them to be exactly 23,000 tons. I'll let you decide whether I believe that figure after having read enough about them in the archives. One of the interesting things I found with both Ark Royal's program and the Illustrious class program, the interesting thing about the Illustrious class program is it does generate an entire smorgasbord of carrier designs. It's harking back to the capital ship designs periods they did, and the same with the Ark Royal design series, in that the Royal Navy looks an entire slew of designs. Including quite a lot of designs they officially shouldn't have been looking at, let's be honest. Because they have designs for carriers which are up to 30,000 tons of standard displacement. Happily have designs for them. And it's almost, the Royal Navy's got the policy of, they design what their dream carrier would be, what they would like to build, based on their doctrine of thinking at the time. And then they go through the scenarios they think they're going to face. and they lop off what they can most afford to lose. And please note, it's not what they least want. It's what they can most afford to lose. And they decide that with the illustrious class, the decision making goes through A, they want them to be survivable as they can make them. And let's be honest, the illustrious class are frigging tough ships. Look at the damage they take during World War II. And they ride back out again. The sheer amount of damage they take, and they ride back out again. The size and scale of the bombs they stand up to, chucked to them by the Germans and the Italians, and the full range of the Japanese hits they get in their operations at the end of the war as part of the British Pacific Fleet. These are very solidly built ships. But the thing they prioritize is operations, i.e., how many sorties can we generate per aircraft with this design? And that's the really interesting thing. If we consider a lot of the current modern debate about carriers is sortie generation and sortie rate generation, what kind of sortie rate can we generate from an aircraft? It's a really modern turn of thinking. And I would say it's the thing is, you find it in the Royal Navy. The US Navy is sort of heading in this direction, but they're still concentrating on that big strike, and that's the big thing, to be able to range and operate the big strike as quickly as they possibly can. And then when that strike's in the air, then they can reorientate themselves and get everything working again and all these things. No, the British carriers, especially the illustrious class onwards, are really orientated heavily around sortie generation. On getting the most value per aircraft out of every single aircraft they carry. And yes, they have to be because they're carrying a smaller air group, but they're carrying a smaller air group because they've gone for as survivable carriers they can get. And some of the designs they're looking at, I found notes around them. I haven't found actual drawings of those ones, but I found notes around things which suggest they had looked at designs and options with deck edge lifts. They went against them because they weren't sure about the survivability level. And that's the main thing. But again, it's the British putting in a lot of thought process to it, like the Americans have been, and the Japanese. I haven't done the video about the Japanese naval aviation doctrine yet. I'm going to be recording that actually next week, although it won't be coming out till next month, until June. But it's part of the things I've been looking at doing, and I don't want to get in some of the discussion points about Japanese carriers because I haven't done that video yet. So I do apologize in this video. If you're watching this video and you're going, you've missed this bit and this bit, please go and watch my doctrine videos on the US Navy and the Royal Navy's aviation doctrines. That's going to explain a lot of detail about them. There are going to be key ship videos about every single one of the classes in this discussion, which go through their technical details, their historical operations. These are overview videos. These are videos that are giving you an introduction to what's going on in the treaty period. And the thing is, the British are pushing all this through with the knowledge that one of the biggest things they're going to lose, but they can afford to lose it, is overall force maintenance and survivability, because Ark Royal had two hangars. To support carriers like the illustrious class in operations, you're going to need to carry those spare aircraft elsewhere. You're going to want to maximize their ability to generate aviation capabilities. They're going to need to hand off any major critical work on aircraft that needs to be done to maintain their air group operations to someone else. Now, that can be a land base. If you're operating Mediterranean, you're going to have Alexandria, Malta, Gibraltar. You've got lots of land facilities you can hand aircraft off to and get new aircraft from. So that really doesn't matter. But in the Far East, that's a different scenario. And this is where the Light Fleet Carrier program comes from. It's HMS Unicorn. She's a forward aviation support ship. She's not an aircraft carrier. And she is something which is really unique to the Royal Navy. Because again, this is part of the whole adaptations of naval aviation this period and everyone going on. And the fact is, the treaties affect the treaties force everyone in a way to move away from each other more than they probably historically would have if there hadn't been for the treaties, to evaluate things even more on a personal level, because they have to get what they need under limitations. Limitations in individual ship tonnage, limitations in cumulative tonnage. In this case, she's a forward aviation support ship because she is technically not an aircraft carrier. How is she technically not an aircraft carrier? Well, if we go back to the Second London Naval Treaty and its texts, well, there's a very interesting point here. A very interesting point. Auxiliary vessels are naval surface vessels, the standard displacement of which exceeds 100 tons, that's 102 metric tons, which are normally employed on fleet duties or as troop transports or in some other way done as fighting ships, and which are not specifically built as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun with a caliber exceeding 6.1 inches, that's 155 millimeters. Mount more than 8 guns with a caliber exceeding 3 inches, that's 76 millimeters. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, are designed for protection by armor plate, are designed for a speed greater than 28 knots, are designed or adapted primarily for operating aircraft at sea, or mount more than 2 aircraft launching apparatus. Now, HMS Unicorn, as designed, was going to have a nice structure in the middle of her flight deck, so of course she was a forward aviation maintenance ship. And she had a top speed of 24 knots. She mounted 8 4-inch guns. Exactly. She had no torpedoes. And she had minimal protection. Minimal. 2 inches of armor on the flight deck level. Magazines 2 to 3 inches around them, bulkheads are 1.5 inches, and that has completed because there are some modifications as she's being built. For example, the structure disappears that was going to be in the middle of the deck. Completely disappears. The main thing that was supposed to be essential to allowing her carry out her maintenance duties disappears very easily. All sorts of things which were done with her design. And of course she becomes a template for the light fleet carriers, which, as said, are modifications of her design. But her design, it comes from the same design study as the Illustrious class. It's all part of the same study, it's part of the same development. And she really is a nice place to end. Because, let's be honest, at this point, the Japanese carriers constructed after those featured do not... Let's be honest, there is enough difference between Soryu and Hiryu and treaty limitations, let alone the ones that come after them. The Essex class, they aren't laid down till... I think the first one's July 1940 from memory? Let me just check. Yes, it's July 1940. Well into wartime, watching the British and the British war and what they're getting up to. So yeah, that they're all part of it that's coming up in the next of these videos. So we're at the end, really. And this has been more of a discussion, I would say, an overview, than anything else. But I still do have questions that I would like to put at the end for you to think about. And really it's 3 questions. Because this is quite a large period, it's a bit of an open-ended thought process. I already mentioned at the end that I think if it hadn't been for the treaties, you would have seen more convergence in carrier design than divergence, because the Royal Navy wants alpha strike capability, both the US Navy and the IJN Navy would want to have that constant flow of operations, be able to maximize sortie generation rate. They all want survivability of carriers. It's just how do you make all that fit, and what are you, how do I put this, most prepared to lose, in a way, according to your doctrine and judgment, that affects your carrier design. But if you don't have the treaty limitations forcing you to build carriers below this displacement, What do you do? And as said, I think there are 3 criteria where that can happen. I think the criteria where that can happen is if there's no cumulative limitation from the Washington Treaty onwards, in terms of carrier construction. Then I think everyone's building 27,000 ton carriers very quickly. And who knows what they turn out like, but it could be interesting. Or alternatively, you're putting it at level pegging of with capital ships. So you're allowed 15 capital ships, great, you're allowed 15 carriers. Either way, you have basically the cumulative limitation of putting it down at 5 is gone, because 5 is too small for Britain and America, and 3 is definitely not enough for Japan. And don't get me started on Italy and France, that's just absurd. So either you have no or far greater limitations on your carrier construction in terms of cumulative. You can't do a cumulative tonnage. You can't do a maximum unit tonnage. Well, you can't do a cumulative tonnage without a maximum unit tonnage. You cannot do that. It doesn't work. Maximum unit tonnage you can do without a cumulative tonnage, so you could still say we're limiting you to 27,000 tons. The other scenario where I think you could have seen them building far more true to what they'd have wanted in their dreams rather than they were forced to sacrifice for is a scenario where you have those light carriers. So where you have a sort of, let's say, on the London Treaty, when they bring in the whole doctrine of heavy cruisers and light cruisers, because they suddenly decide, yeah, we've taken our definition of cruisers and things from the Hawkins class, which were an improved version of the Atlantic class theoretical design, which were an improved version of the Town class of 1910 design light cruiser. And that video is coming out at some point. Yeah, we're doing all that. We can therefore do, as we're making this into a gratiated heavy and light cruiser, we can do something with the aircraft carrier. I think though, if you do that, the scenario, if you're breaking up aircraft carrier like that, might you break up capital ships? Might you add in a small category, a smaller category of capital ships? Might you do more of a gratiation with the cruisers? If you bring in, let's say, 15,000 ton limit for a light carrier, do you bring in a 15,000 ton limit for your heavy cruiser? And let's say a 9,000 ton limit for your light cruiser? And a 3,000 ton limit for your destroyer? Do you do it that way? Do you stack it all up that way? You could do. That would give you a large amount of clearance between what qualifies as a light destroyer, what qualifies as a light cruiser, and what qualifies as a heavy cruiser. It would be highly intriguing to see that happen, and how that would affect things. It could produce a more equitable treaty, but it's going to depend on how they do it, and let's be honest, I don't have much faith in the negotiating powers in how they do it, because they all seem to be very short-term self-interest and not long-term. But there again, that's most treaty negotiations. And of course, the third option is that the treaty system breaks down completely in the 1930 London Treaty. That Japan and Italy walk away then. Because if they did, well, then by the time you get to the carriers being built, probably in the mid-30s onwards, no one's going to be worrying too much about treaty limitations, and they're going to be building the carriers they want. And so, for the Royal Navy, as said, you get something probably not too dissimilar to the Implacable class. Not too dissimilar. Probably Implacables with Ark Royal-sized hangars. That's what you probably get. Because that's basically the Royal Navy's dream. At a spirit, that's what the Royal Navy would like. Then, of course, you don't get a Unicorn or any of the smaller carriers, because you just have a one-size-fits-all. This carrier can do its own maintenance, can do all its own operations. It's got the second hangar for the maintenance. It's got all those facilities. It's got the armor survivability for the Mediterranean, South China Sea. It's got the air group for the strikes on Kiel, on Wilhelmshaven, or Taranto, or Yokosuka, anywhere you want to go, it's got what you need. And I could have listed off Pearl Harbor as well, though, because, let's be honest, the British and Americans love to wargame fighting each other and exercise fighting the Japanese. So, you know, they'll always have it as a wargame option. But I want to hear what you think. Do you think, under any of those circumstances, do you think the carriers would grow closer, similar to each other? Or do you think they diverge more? What do you think, under those situations, what would happen? My view is they'd actually grow closer together because they're all chasing the same thing. It's just that the treaty limitations force them to pick and choose. But I'd love to hear what you think that would happen. And, well, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Next week is going to be conception, operation, and conclusion of the Lexington class, where we get more into the specifics of the Lexingtons rather than a large overview. And then we have the Shokaku class as last of this month. And 845 Squadron Royal Navy are this month's Squadron Oversight and Squadron Focus. Well, hey. Next month, in June, we have Carriers of the War Fleet. Then we have Damage Control, when it went wrong and when it went right. Then we have the Imperial Japanese Naval Aircraft Squadron System and their structuring. And then we have HMS Unicorn, an entire video dedicated to a very interesting ship and its conception, its discussion, its completion, all those things going around. And then we have July, Second War Emergency Ships. Ninth, the Bogue Ruler Attacker class, how the different navies use them and how they change them. The escort carriers. 801 Squadron Royal Navy are that month's squadron focus. And then we have 23rd of July, conception, operation conclusion of USS Ranger and USS Wasp, trying to build a light fleet carrier. And again, there's been some focus on them today, but there's going to be more focus coming up. And it's the 30th of July is Japanese World War II Carrier Naval Aviation Doctrine, pre-war to war. It's a fun time coming. During June and July, the Thursday lives will be premieres. I hope you're going to enjoy them. And during August, the Thursday's lives will be back. I will still be on Discord. Try to be on Discord on Thursday evenings after the premieres to chat away, and I will try to make it to the premieres. The reason I've paused them for that period is because I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing vis-a-vis moving home and potentially going travelling with the shipshape crew. So, with all that said, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And I hope well, all my history videos are about hopefully giving the people watching something to go and think about. And I hope that was the case for today's video. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.